The morning Vera Staunton drove her truck through the gates of Dunmore Hollow. The thermometer outside the Hendrick County feed store already read 91 degrees at 7 in the morning. And not a single person in the county would have predicted that within 3 years, those same people would be standing in the yard of that same hollow with their hats in their hands, waiting on her word. They stood there now in the August that would later be recorded as the driest in 112 years of local weather-keeping. And the air over the ridge had gone the color of old brass, and the hollow was the only place in 4 townships where anything living was still doing what living things are supposed to do. Vera stood at the fence, her forearms resting on the top rail, and she looked at the crowd gathered along the lane, and the crowd looked back at her. And nobody said much of anything, because there was nothing much left to say that the land had not already said plainly and first. She had not changed the hollow, she had listened to it. That is the only thing she had done differently from everyone else, and it turned out to be the only thing that mattered. But to understand what she did and why, you have to go back 30 months to the afternoon she first saw them. 7 sows standing in a broken pen on a property that 4 other buyers had already turned down, and you have to understand what everyone in Hendrick County thought of her and of those sows on that particular November day. She was 38 years old when she came to Hendrick County, which in the judgment of the county itself was neither old enough to know better nor young enough to be forgiven for her mistakes. She had come from a city which was strike 1. She was unmarried and intended to remain so, which was strike 2. She had purchased, sight mostly unseen, the old Dunmore property on the hollow of the same name. 41 acres of second-hand limestone and clay soil running down to a creek that was polite enough to run, but never ambitious about it, and she had paid $47,000 for the land and the buildings, which were a house with a leaning chimney, a barn in a state of philosophical collapse, and a set of hog pens that had not held anything with a heartbeat in 6 years. The county assessed the property at $39,000. Her friends, the 3 or 4 who still answered the phone, told her the number. 47 gave them a stomachache. But Vera had done the arithmetic, which was the first and last thing she always did before she moved in any direction, and the arithmetic had told her that $47,000 for 41 acres in a county with reliable groundwater was a number she could survive. The arithmetic was simple in its bones and brutal in its details. She had $61,000, which was what remained of her mother's estate, after the estate's debts were cleared and the executor was paid, and the 2-year argument among the siblings was finally resolved. $61,000 going in, $47,000 for the property, $14,000 remaining. She needed the property to begin generating something within 18 months, or the $14,000 would run to nothing, and the bank would have a conversation with her that she did not want to have. 18 months was the number she carried in her chest like a flat stone, and she pressed it there when she woke at 4 in the morning and felt the size of what she had done. It was not a comfortable stone, but it was a real one. And real things had always steadied her more than comfortable ones. She had not planned on pigs. The pigs arrived, in a manner of speaking, through the secondary listing on the County Agricultural Board, a handwritten card pinned below the printed notices, which read, 7 Hendrick gilt sows, mature, proven, free to good home or best offer. Contact Elsa Mabry, Lot 12, Ridge Road. She had driven out to look at them on a gray Tuesday in early November, not because she had any confidence in pigs, but because free to good home or best offer was an arithmetic phrase, and arithmetic phrases demanded investigation. What she found at Lot 12 on Ridge Road was Elsa Mabry, who was 81 years old and leaving for her daughter's place in another state by the end of the month, and 7 sows standing in a broken pen. And those sows were something she had not expected. They were Hendrick Gilts, a regional landrace breed that the county itself had produced over roughly 100 years of selective keeping by families who had understood that the limestone creek soil of this particular watershed grew a particular kind of forage, and that a pig shaped to use that forage would outlast and outperform any exotic breed the Extension Service recommended in any given decade. They were large animals, deep-bodied and long, with a reddish-gold color along the back fading to cream at the belly. And they moved with a deliberate, unhurried confidence that Vera had never associated with pigs. The dominant sow, the largest, stood apart from the others and regarded Vera across the fence with small amber eyes that carried, she thought, an expression very close to assessment. She named her Constance before she had made any decision at all, which was how she knew the decision was already made. Elsa Mabry wanted $800 for the 7 of them, which was a number arrived at, not by any market logic, but by the logic of old grief. She had kept the breed for 30 years. Her husband had kept it before her for 20 years before that. The industrial operations that had moved into the county in the 1990s had made the Hendrick Gilt officially obsolete by the early 2000s. Too slow-growing, too expensive to finish, not suited to confinement systems. The meat too dark and too fat marbled for the commodity chain. The breed registry had lapsed. The association had dissolved. Elsa Mabry's 7 sows were, as nearly as anyone who still cared about such things could determine, the last 7 registered Hendrick Gilt breeding females in existence. Court. Vera wrote the check for $800 and did not sleep that night, not because of the sows, but because of what she had spent, $47,800, leaving $13,200 between herself and the conversation with the bank. The stone in her chest had gotten heavier and colder. She pressed it there and breathed. And in the morning she went back to Lot 12 and helped Elsa Mabry load 7 sows into a borrowed trailer and drove them home to Dunmore Hollow. The county found out about the pigs before she had finished mending the first section of fencing. This was not a county that was slow with information. By the time she had driven 24 fence posts and strung the wire, 3 separate people had stopped on the road above the hollow and called down to ask about the Hendrick Gilts, and their tone was not the tone of people asking because they were interested in the answer. It was the tone of people asking because the answer was already settled and the question was just the formal declaration of a verdict. "Old Elsa's pigs," they said. "Lord, the Hendrick Gilts. Well, a woman alone out here with 7 old sows of a breed nobody's wanted since 2003. That'll be something to watch." The last phrase was the one that stayed with her, because it was the honest one. It was going to be something to watch, all right. She intended to make sure of that. She met Harris Callow for the first time at the Hendrick County Farm Supply the following week, which was where she went to price board service and understand the practical situation before she made any further decisions. Harris Callow was the regional development manager for Consolidated Livestock Partners, a company that had, over the previous decade, absorbed 11 of the county's 16 mid-size hog operations into a vertically integrated system that contracted growing feed supply and slaughter under a single agreement that the company's own lawyers had written and that the company's own auditors reviewed. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in pressed khaki and a collared shirt with a small embroidered logo, and he had the smile of a man who had learned that smiling at the right moment was more efficient than arguing. He introduced himself before she had finished her inquiry at the counter, which told her he had been watching the counter, or someone at the counter had told him she was there, and both possibilities were equally instructive. He said he had heard she'd picked up old Elsa Mabry's sows. And what a shame about that, really, because those old Hendrick Gilts were a piece of the county's history, and he had nothing but respect for the tradition. But as a practical matter, the breed was finished. The performance data just wasn't there. And if she was serious about making something work on Dunmore Hollow, he'd be glad to sit down and talk about a growing contract that could have her in positive cash flow within 6 months. He could offer her a startup package, feed her pigs from the company's own sow pool, feed on account, guaranteed prices. He said he was making the offer because he believed in supporting new producers and the county needed people willing to work. He said the sows she'd bought were essentially pets at this point, and he meant no disrespect. He said if she ever wanted to sell them for what she had in them, call him. He'd see what he could do. His card was heavy cardstock with a silver logo. Vera took the card and said thank you and asked the counter clerk about boar service and left. She drove back to the hollow and pinned his card to the support post in the barn with a single nail driven through the silver logo so she could see it while she worked. It was not a gesture of defiance. It was a practical reminder of the arithmetic. If she could not make the Hendrik guilt pay within 18 months, Harris Callow's number was the one she would be calling, and not on her own terms. The first winter was the education. She had read everything she could find about the Hendrik guilt, which was not much, because the breed had never been documented beyond local memory and a handful of entries in old state fair programs from the 1950s and 60s. What she had was Elsa Mabry's memory, transcribed across 3 phone calls before Elsa's daughter moved her out of phone range. And her own observation, the observation was the more reliable source. She watched the Sows for 6 weeks before she changed anything about their management, which meant she was watching them in December and January, when the hollow was gray and cold and the work was grim and solitary, and the 14,000, minus winter feed and propane, and the materials for a roof patch on the barn. The Sows moved across the lower 40 acres in a loose collective pattern that was not random. They returned to the same hillside at the same hours. They rooted in particular places and left others alone. They drank from the creek at specific bends. Constance, the dominant sow, never led them. She positioned herself at the rear and moved last, which Vera initially interpreted as age and later understood as something else entirely. The mathematics of the situation at the end of February stood at $11,400, remaining 7 sows, 1 boar arranged on a service lease at a cost she had negotiated down to materials and a half-quart of firewood, and a first farrowing expected in mid-April if the timing held. $11,400, 18 months had become 15. She pressed the stone and breathed. It was in March that Paul Zorek came across the hollow's fence line for the first time. He was 74 years old, a retired orchard keeper who had immigrated from Poland in the 1970s and had farmed the adjacent 30 acres in a manner the county regarded as eccentric, which meant he did not use the inputs the Extension Service recommended, did not attend the meetings, and had never lost a fruit crop to the blight that had taken 2/3 of the county's orchards in 2 separate outbreaks over the past 20 years. He came to the fence carrying a wax paper parcel of sausage made from his own hogs, which were a different old breed he had been keeping quietly for 30 years, and he looked at the Hendrik gilts for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "A root knows where the water is before the farmer does. You watch where they root, you will know where the water is, too." She said she had been watching. He said, "Good. Most people look, but they are not watching. There is a difference." He gave her the sausage and left. She thought about what he had said for 3 days, and on the 4th day, she walked the line the sows had been working most persistently along the east slope of the lower hollow, a strip of ground that looked no different from the rest, but that Constance and 2 of the younger sows returned to every morning in a slow, systematic rooting pattern that Vera had logged in. The small notebook she kept in her hip pocket, she had the notebook because numbers and observations written down were the only argument she trusted entirely. On the morning of the 4th day, she brought a probe rod and pushed it into the earth along the rooting line in a dozen places, and in 6 of those places she found, at a depth of 18 to 24 inches, a layer of dark, moist organic material overlying a shelf of fractured limestone that was weeping water from some slow subterranean source she had not known existed. The soil above it was alive in a way the rest of the slope was not. She stood on that hillside with a probe rod in her hand and a cold March air moving down through the hollow, and she thought about the arithmetic of what the sows had been doing to that ground over the winter, turning it, aerating it, working the organic matter down into the moisture layer. And she understood that the Hendrik gilts had not been eating the land. They had been farming it, And they had been farming it the way they had been bred to farm it for 100 years in this particular watershed, on this particular limestone, above this particular kind of slow seep, and nobody had thought to ask them what they knew because nobody had believed they knew anything worth asking about. The stone in her chest did not disappear, but its weight shifted. It became less like dread and more like ballast. The April farrowing produced 43 piglets from 5 of the 7 sows, which was not a spectacular number by commercial standards, and was in fact the number that 2 people at the Hendrick County Co-op meeting mentioned by name when the news circulated, because 43 from 5, which was below the industry target of 10 to 12, and this was offered as confirmation of what everyone already understood, which was that the Hendrick gilt was a finished breed for a reason, and the woman at Dunmore Hollow was going to discover that reason at some cost to herself. What those 2 people did not mention, because they did not know, was that 43 piglets from 5 sows in mid-April on a cold, wet limestone hollow, with no confinement housing, no heat supplementation, and no antibiotic protocols, Jod. With a first-time hog producer managing the farrowing alone except for a 10-year-old boy named Theo Bright, who had walked over from the Bright family's depleted rented farm 3 miles up the road, was a number that told a different story than the one the co-op meeting was telling. Theo Bright had appeared at the gate of Dunmore Hollow in early March, small for his age, wearing a coat that had been bought for a larger child or a smaller adult, carrying nothing and asking nothing. He had heard about the Hendrick gilts from somewhere in the way that children hear about things, through the lateral transmission of overheard adult conversation, and he had come to look at them. He stayed for 4 hours the first day and came back the following Saturday, and the one after that he never asked permission, and she never required it. He named every piglet within 24 hours of farrowing, working through the litters, with a systematic thoroughness that suggested he had thought about it in advance. And his names were practical and observational. The one with the notched ear was Notch. The one that always led the scramble to the teat was First. One that slept apart from the others was Bishop. He recorded the names in his own small notebook which he produced from his coat pocket, and this was the moment Vera understood that Theo Bright was not a visitor but a partner, because you only bring a notebook when you intend to keep track of something over time. By June, the 43 piglets had become 39 finished weaners of exceptional robustness, a 4 piglet lost to mishap, and 1 to a respiratory infection that resolved without treatment, and Vera had moved them onto the east slope below the moisture seep and watched the Hendrick gilts do something she had not read about and could not have predicted, which was that the sows organized the weaners into a grazing rotation across the seep's influence zone, moving them in arcs that kept the rooting pressure distributed and the recovery time sufficient for the ground to regenerate. Constance directed this from her rear position, which Vera now understood was not slowness but supervision. The old sow was managing the land. She had done this before. She had done this, in her body's deep knowledge, on limestone hollow ground for her entire life, and she would teach it to her daughters, because that was what the breed had always done, and the fact that nobody in the county had cared to watch it happen did not make it less true. The notebook filled. She started a second one. The numbers in it were not the numbers Harris Callow cared about, which were daily gain and feed conversion and days to market weight. The numbers in her notebook were different. Moisture content of the soil at the rooting line on the 1st of each month. Forage diversity counts. The number of distinct plant species establishing in the worked ground. Weight gain per piglet per week. Plotted against the date. Each litter was introduced to the east slope. Ground temperature differential between the seep zone and the untouched west slope. These were not the measurements anyone had told her to take. They were the measurements the land was offering, and she took them because Paul Sorek had told her to watch rather than look, and because she had understood instinctively what he meant, which was that watching was a form of listening, and that the land, like any living thing, said what it had to say in its own register, at its own pace, and would not repeat itself to someone who was not paying attention. The outside world intruded in July in the form of a man named Deacon Pruitt, who arrived at Dunmore Hollow in a truck with out-of-state plates and a cooler in the back, and who explained that he supplied 3 restaurants in a city 4 hours away, restaurants that were paying a significant premium for heritage pork of documented provenance, and that he had heard about the Hendrick Gilts through a breed registry reconstruction effort being undertaken by an agricultural university, whose extension department had recently gotten very interested in regional land races. He tasted the first cuts Vera had processed from her earliest market animals. 2 barrows she had finished on the east slope at 8 months of age, and he sat very still for a moment after the tasting and then asked what she was getting per pound from the local auction. She told him he named a number that was 2.5 times the auction price and said he could take 12 animals per quarter if she could supply them. He said the intramuscular fat distribution was unlike anything he had seen in heritage pork. More complex, he thought, related to the forage profile the animals were accessing, and the depth of flavor suggested a stress-minimal finishing environment that was almost impossible to replicate in any managed system he had encountered. He asked if she had ever considered scaling up. She said she had considered everything. She took his number and gave him hers, and after he left, she sat in the barn with the notebook in her lap for a long time. The arithmetic had just changed. Not enough to relax, not nearly enough to stop watching, but the stone had shifted again. She did not tell anyone in the county about Deacon Pruitt. This was not deception. She had simply learned, through 38 years of being the kind of person who was told she was wrong before anyone had checked whether she was right, that a private truth held close is safer than a public truth held loose, and that the time to show your hand is when the stakes are high enough to make showing it matter. She entered the numbers in the notebook, in a column. She headed Q revenue, without elaboration, and she kept farming. Theo Bright knew something had changed because he watched her the way she watched Constance, from a distance and with patience, and one afternoon he said, "Somebody came who understood what they are, didn't they?" It was not a question. She said, "Yes." He nodded and went back to filling water. The second farrowing in the fall was from 6 sows, the 7th having gone into retirement in the only way available to her, mourned by Theo more than by anyone. Her name entered in his notebook with a double line beneath it, as was his custom for marking things that were finished. The second farrowing produced 51 piglets from 6 sows, 8.5 per litter on average, and the count would have looked unremarkable to Harris Callow, who was by this time making his second approach to Dunmore Hollow. He came in October, driving alone, and his smile was the same. But something behind it had changed by 1 or 2 degrees in the direction of effort, meaning it was requiring slightly more of him to maintain. He said he had heard she was doing all right out here, which was generous language for what he had heard, and he wanted to revisit his earlier offer because his company was expanding its integration program, and he had more flexibility on startup terms than he'd had before. He could offer a premium genetic agreement where she supplied breeding stock to his company's sow pool. He named a number per head for the sows. He said it was a significant number relative to what a Hendrick Gilt would bring at auction. She said, "I appreciate the offer." He waited for the second half of the sentence. There was no second half. He said he'd leave the terms with her in writing and she could look them over. She said she was sure she could. He left. The terms went on the post beside the first card, which had faded over the winter but was still legible through the nail hole in the silver logo. It was in the late spring of the 3rd year that the summer arrived early and wrong. It came not gradually, the way heat is supposed to come in this county, building through May and peaking in July, but all at once, like the county had walked through a door into another climate entirely. By the first week of June, the creek was 1/3 of its normal depth. By the 3rd week, it had gone to standing pools, dark gaps between them, and the pastures that the county's conventional hog operations and cattle operations depended on had turned the color of old straw. A drought advisory became a drought declaration. the declaration became an emergency. The county agricultural officer drove through the townships, and the news that came back was the same everywhere. Water, feed, and cash were all running short in exactly that order, and the catastrophe was going to sort the farms into those that survived and those that did not, and nobody yet knew which category they were in. Vera knew which category she was in. She had known since March, when she had checked the moisture readings along the east slope and found the seep was not diminishing, but was in fact slightly more active, as if the pressure differential created by the dry surface was drawing the subsurface water upward. The east slope was still green. The forage plants that had established in the Hendrick Gilts worked ground, a diverse community of deep-rooted species that had been in the county's soil seed bank for decades, waiting for the right disturbance, were still growing. The sows were still cycling through their rotation. The water in the trough off the seep ran full. This was not magic. It was the arithmetic of 100 years of a breed, shaped to this particular ground, doing what it had always done, which was to cultivate the conditions of its own survival in a way that happened to also cultivate the conditions of everything around it. The ground remembered. Paul Sorek had been right about that from the beginning. The first person to come was not the most important, but she was the most honest. Marlene Dryber drove up the hollow lane in the second week of June with a trailer and a sunburned face, and a look that Vera recognized as the look of someone who has been rehearsing an apology for a longer drive than they had planned. Marlene had been one of the louder voices at the co-op meeting 18 months ago, the one who had said 8.6 per liter in a tone that required no further elaboration. She had 63 weaner pigs on her operation that were running out of viable pasture, and she could not afford the commercial feed to finish them in confinement, and she had heard, through the particular lateral transmission, that the county employed for information it did not want to be seen transmitting, that Dunmore Hollow was still green. She said she was not asking for charity. She said she could pay fair lease on the acreage, and she understood if Vera said no, and she would not hold it against her. Vera said she would need to think about it overnight, which was true. She was not performing deliberation. She was actually running the arithmetic in the second notebook. In the column she had added the previous fall, when she had first understood that the east slope could carry more pressure than her own animals were applying to it. And she had to know whether 63 additional animals for a finishing period of 8 to 10 weeks would damage what the Hendrick Gilts had built, or whether the rotation logic could absorb them without permanent harm. She called Paul Sorek that evening and described the east slope's current carrying capacity and the moisture readings from March, April, and May. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The ground that has been taught how to give does not forget the lesson. A teacher does not stop knowing what she knows because a new student arrives. You will need to watch carefully. But the slope has learned." She called Marlene Dryberg in the morning and said, "Yes," and named a lease rate that was honest rather than opportunistic, and said she would need Marlene's help managing the rotation, and she would need Marlene's agreement that the Hendrick Gilts set the pace and the pattern, meaning they went first and the commercial animals followed, because the sows knew the ground and Marlene's pigs did not. Marlene agreed without negotiation, which was itself a kind of testimony to how the world had changed. Harris Callow came on a Wednesday, and he did not come alone. He came with a man from the county zoning office named Fredericks, and a young woman who was introduced as his company's agricultural compliance coordinator. And this time, there was no pretense of the casual visit. He said the county was facing a declared agricultural emergency, and Consolidated Livestock Partners had a responsibility to help stabilize regional production, and he was prepared to offer Vera a resource-sharing agreement under which her surplus water access and forage acreage would be made available to his company's contracting producers. Under a revenue-sharing arrangement that he outlined in 3 typed pages, that the compliance coordinator produced from a leather portfolio, the revenue-sharing arrangement, read carefully, meant that Consolidated Livestock Partners would manage the access and take the revenue and pay Vera a monthly facility fee that, coincidentally, was nearly identical to the number Harris Callow had offered for her sows 18 months ago. She read all 3 pages at the kitchen table while he waited. Fredericks from the zoning office looked uncomfortable. The compliance coordinator looked at her phone. Harris Callow maintained the smile. Vera read the pages a second time and set them down and said, "Mr. Callow, when did you last have someone walk the East Slope?" He said he hadn't had occasion to visit the East Slope personally. She said, "Someone has, I keep notes. The readings along the East Slope show foot traffic in January that I didn't make, and that Theo Bright didn't make, and that Powell Sorek didn't make. I've got the dates and the approximate positions. I've also got the name you gave Deacon Pruitt's restaurant supplier when you called them in November, which was the Dunmore Hollow Heritage Project, which is not a name I use, and not a name anyone here has ever used, except now apparently you." The compliance coordinator had stopped looking at her phone. Fredericks from the zoning office had the expression of a man who wanted to be somewhere he had never heard of. Harris Callow's smile completed its long journey to finished. He said the conversation had taken a direction he hadn't intended, and perhaps they should revisit the agreement terms. Vera said, "The terms I'm offering are not in your pages. The terms I'm offering are that the acreage of the East Slope is available to any farm in the county that needs it for the duration of the emergency, at a finishing lease that covers the labor of rotation management, which is mine and Marlene Dryberg's and Theo Bright's, and that the Hendrick Gilts set the rotation schedule, and that every producer who uses the slope agrees to a 2-year grazing moratorium on whatever portion of their own ground needs recovery. Under a plan I'll help them write. Your company is welcome to participate on those terms like anyone else, which means paying the labor lease and following the rotation, but you will not manage the access, and you will not name it or market it or set the rates, because the slope is not yours, and neither is the breed, and neither is what they have built here together." He said that was not a workable structure for his company. She said she understood that. She said she hoped he'd have a safe drive back. Fredericks from the zoning office thanked her on the way out the door. He said it quietly, facing away from Harris Callow, and she nodded and let it stand at that. The next 2 weeks were the ones the county would tell about for a long time afterward. In the lateral transmission way, it told about things it had not quite witnessed directly, but had absorbed through proximity to someone who had. 17 farms brought animals to Dunmore Hollow in that period, which meant 17 families had conversations with their pride before they had conversations with Vera. And every one of those conversations had a shape that was more or less like Marlene Dryberg's. The long drive, the rehearsed speech, the honest statement of need. She did not make any of them easy, exactly, but she did not make them harder than they already were, which was the only grace she knew how to offer, and the only kind worth offering. The labor lease was low. The rotation plan was real. She drafted each farm's recovery plan herself in the evenings, from the notebook data and Powell Sorek's consultation, and she sent Theo Bright with each plan to explain it, because Theo could explain things about the land in the plain declarative language of a child who had watched carefully. And plain declarative language was what people in crisis could actually hear. Harris Callow left the county in the 3rd week of July. Not permanently, in the geographical sense. His company still held contracts here, and would for some years. But he left in the sense that mattered, which was that, after the Wednesday, at Vera's kitchen table, he stopped being the person who controlled the direction of things. The county understood this, even if it did not say so in any meeting or any newspaper. The county understood it, the way it understood everything important, obliquely and collectively, and all at once. Consolidated Livestock Partners contract renewal rates in Hendrick County dropped by 4 operations the following year, and then by 3 more, and the former contract producers cited in their exit letters a preference for direct marketing and breed diversification, which was a polite way of saying they had watched what happened on the East Slope and had begun to think about the arithmetic of their own dependence differently. Powell Sorek came to the hollow in late September when the drought had broken in. The slow way droughts break in this part of the country, not with dramatic storms, but with a gradual return of humidity and overcast and a week of gentle, persistent rain that fell as if the sky were simply correcting an oversight. He stood at the east slope fence with Vera and Theo and looked at the ground, which was recovering visibly, the forage communities pulling together, the Hendrik gilts moving through their rotation with the unhurried confidence of animals who had never doubted the ground would come back because they were the reason it was coming back. Constance's oldest daughter, a sow Theo had named Tenure, now led the morning movement, and Constance herself had taken the rear supervisory position that was the position of the one who already knew how everything was going to turn out. Paul said, "A root knows where the water is before the farmer does." He said it as if for the first time, with the same gentle cadence, because he understood that the things worth saying are worth saying again at the moment that gives them their second meaning. She said she knew. He said, "Now the farmers know too. This is better than the root knowing alone." Theo wrote this down in his notebook. He had started a third notebook by September, because the first two were full, and the third had a different character from the first two. It contained not only measurements and names and rotation records, but small drawings of the sows in their positions, and maps of the east slope at different stages of recovery. In Theo's careful, deliberate handwriting, the words Dunmore Hollow Breed Records, Volume 3, which was not a title anyone had assigned him, but which was exactly right, because that was what it was, and Theo Bright had always called things what they were. The county's formal recognition of the Hendrik gilt came the following spring through the Agricultural Extension Office, which published a breed profile in its quarterly newsletter based on the data Vera supplied from the 3 notebooks and the additional observations Deacon Pruitt's restaurant partners had contributed after the breed attracted the attention of a heritage foods organization whose board included 2 members of a national agricultural press. The profile described the Hendrik gilt as a regional landrace of exceptional ecological function, specifically adapted to the limestone creek hollow soils of the watershed, possessing a forage intelligence and a soil cultivation behavior that warranted serious conservation attention. The profile was 2 pages long and included a photograph of Constance's daughter, Tenure, standing on the east slope in the early morning light, which Theo had taken with a camera Vera had bought him for his 12th birthday. And the photograph was remarkably good for reasons that had everything to do with the patience of the photographer and nothing to do with the equipment. The breeders who came were not all local. Some drove 3 hours. One drove 7. They came with notebooks and questions, and in several cases with a humility that was earned rather than performed, which is the only kind that is any use. Vera answered their questions from her own notebooks and from Powell Sorik's accumulated wisdom, which she was careful to attribute, and from the observations of Theo Bright, which she was equally careful to attribute, because the record of who watched and who listened and who wrote it down mattered more to her than any other kind of record. And she intended to keep it honest. The Hendrik Gilt Breed Association was re-established in the 3rd spring, with Vera as its founding registrar, Paul Sorik as its emeritus advisor, and Theo Bright as its record secretary, a position whose title Vera invented because Theo was going to do the work, and the work deserved a name. The association's founding document. 1 page. Written by Vera in the plain-spoken literary vernacular of someone who had grown up reading careful prose and had decided that careful prose was the most honest instrument available, stated that the purpose of the association was to preserve and study a breed shaped by and for a specific landscape, and to ensure that the knowledge the breed carried in its habits and its biology was documented by people willing to watch carefully over time, and that the breed's animals would be distributed to stewards rather than sold to buyers, meaning that acquisition of a registered Hendrik gilt required the completion of a land assessment and a 2-year observation protocol, rather than a check. The check, where one was written, would be nominal and would go into a fund for the recovery of marginal limestone hollow ground throughout the watershed. Marlene Dryberg was the first person on the waiting list for a registered gilt. She had been on it since the morning she drove down the hollow lane with her rehearsed apology and her 63 wieners, and she had spent the waiting time completing the observation protocol, which Vera had helped her design for her own ground. And her records from that protocol were already showing what the east slope had shown 3 years earlier, that the ground had a direction it wanted to go, and that a patient watcher could learn to assist rather than oppose it. Marlene's guilt arrived in late April of the fourth spring, a daughter of tenure, amber-eyed and deliberate, and already at 6 months moving across Marlene's hollow with the assessing patience of an animal that understood the assignment. Vera stood at the fence of her own hollow on the morning the rains came back reliably, the second spring after the drought year, and she watched Tenure's third farrowing moving through the east slope in the early light, and the numbers in the current notebook were as follows: 22 registered breeding females in the county and 2 adjacent counties, 4 active stewardship apprenticeships, 1 ongoing university partnership documenting the breed's forage ecology, and the east slope's moisture readings the highest they had been since she had first inserted the probe rod in that cold March of the first year. The stone she had carried in her chest was gone, not removed exactly, but absorbed, the way a stone in a field gradually becomes part of the field, indistinguishable from the ground that has grown around it, and accepted its weight as given. She did not miss it as a comfort because she had better ballast now, which was the knowing kind. The kind that comes from watching long enough and writing down what you see and letting what is true be true, whether or not anyone in the county believes it yet. Theo Bright came across the lower gate at 7 in the morning, as he had done every Saturday for 3 years, with his notebook under his arm and the same coat, finally replaced last winter, at his mother's insistence, with one that fit. He stopped beside her at the fence, and they watched Tenure moving at the rear of the farrowing group with the unhurried authority of the one who already knows how things will come out. He wrote something in his notebook and showed it to her. It said, "Tenure's litter, all 11 present, 7 on east slope rotation, 4 resting. Constance the second, learning rear position." She looked at the number 11 and thought about the co-op meeting, and the people who had said 8.6 per litter in the tone that required no elaboration. She thought about what the east slope had done to that number, and what Constance had done to it, and what patient attention to the ground had done to it, compounding quietly over 3 years the way a thing compounds when it is left to do what it was made to do in the place it was made to do it. 11 per litter now. From the 3rd generation on the slope, which was 2.5 more than the number that had been offered as proof of worthlessness. She thought about what the east slope had done to that number, and what Constance had done to it, and what patient attention to the ground had done to it, compounding quietly over 3 years the way a thing compounds when it is left to do what it was made to do in the place it was made to do it. 11 per litter now, from the 3rd generation, on the slope which was 2.5 more than the number that had been offered, as proof of worthlessness. The ground remembered. The breed remembered. The numbers, finally, agreed. Paul Surek's voice was in her head as it tended to be in the mornings now, in the way that the voices of people who have told you something true become part of the ambient sound of the place where you heard it. A root knows where the water is before the farmer does. The root had known. The water was there. The farmer had learned to listen. This was the whole of it, really, stated plainly and without ornament, which was the only way it could be stated without losing the part that was true. She was 41 years old. She owned 41 acres of limestone hollow ground and 22% of the founding stock of the only functioning Hendrick Gilt Breed Association in existence. She had 2 full notebooks, and most of a 3rd, and a partnership with a retired Polish orchardman, and an 11-year-old record secretary, and a growing list of stewards who had learned to watch rather than look. She had a leaning chimney and a barn that no longer threatened to become a philosophical position, and a fence line that she had driven herself, post by post, in the first hard winter. She had the hollow and the sows, and the mornings which were the same mornings the county had always had, only now she was in them, which was what belonging felt like when you had earned it the slow way, by staying and watching and letting the ground teach you what it already knew.